Hello and welcome back to the Shades of Orange. Today I want to do part of my October wrap-up. I read so much horror this month that I decided to devote an entire video to it. Before I get into the actual books, I do want to take a quick moment to plug the podcast that I'm part of. It is called Books in the Freezer, which I'm co-hosting with Stephanie from That's What She Read. And I promise I won't talk about this in every video, but just because I'm talking horror, I had to mention that we're doing this in case you missed my other announcements. And basically every episode we're going to be talking about a different subgenre of horror, whether it be haunted houses, possession, etc. And because of that, I am going to be reading a lot of horror books, so you can expect a lot more wrap-ups like this. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying the podcast. I won't necessarily be in every episode just because of scheduling conflicts. Sometimes Stephanie is going to have other hosts on there, but I'm definitely going to be in as many episodes as I can, and I'm just loving it so far. So hopefully you'll check it out, rate us on iTunes, and chat along with us as we talk about all the good horror books. That being said, let's get into all the horror that I read in the month of October. First, I want to talk about The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, which is the story of a woman who believes that her daughter is possessed by a demon and calls on the help of a priest to help exorcise her daughter. This is a modern classic of the horror genre, and I've been meaning to read it for quite a while. I really like possession stories. And because it is more of a classic, I kind of had this preconceived idea that it was going to be very quiet and atmospheric, so I was very surprised, and happily so, that this book was very intense. It's actually quite dark, quite lewd. There is some very vulgar moments in it. Some of the scenes are very offensive, and especially if you come from a background of being religious, particularly Catholic, in some ways you will relate to the story very much because of that connection. But at the same time, if you're quite conservative in your religious beliefs, you might be offended by this book. So I'm always cautious to recommend it to everyone. But if you're a fan of the movie or just enjoy very intense stories, this is a great one to pick up. I don't know if I found it particularly straight up scary, but it was definitely disturbing at times. I do think it was a really good example of possession horror, and I just really loved it. So that one was one of my favorite reads of the month. I just thought it was great, and even though it's an older book, if you haven't read it yet, I really recommend you check it out. Next, I want to mention The Ritual by Adam Nevill, and this is my first time reading one of his books. He's quite a well-known horror writer, and this book is all about a group of young men who are hiking through the Scandinavian wilderness. Their hiking trip is starting to go wrong. Some of them have become injured. They are running out of food when they stumble upon this old abandoned house where some kind of pagan rituals seem to have taken place. And the story takes off from there. And given the subject matter, this is a great example of survival horror. There are some very gruesome and grisly moments in this book. However, I didn't love this book as much as I wanted to. And when it came down to it, I had three main issues. One was I found the writing to be very weak. I didn't like the world building, and I felt like the characters were underdeveloped. Unfortunately, those are pretty big complaints, which did definitely affect my reading and enjoyment of the book as a whole. Basically, what it comes down to is the fact that I never became fully immersed in the story. I felt like Nevill wasn't the best at describing the scenes. While some of the scenes should have been very gruesome, I struggled to really get an image of what he was trying to describe, and for that reason I just never fully connected with the book, which I think is so important when it comes to horror, that you need to be fully immersed and connecting to the story in some way. Otherwise, that's basically the difference for me between a book being scary and a book being boring. And unfortunately, this one just didn't work for me. I liked the idea he was going for. I liked the survival aspects at the beginning, but it was just not quite working for me. Alternatively, another survival horror book that I think worked so much better, at least in my personal opinion, is The Troop by Nick Cutter, which I have been recommended so many times. Julie from A Girl in a Book and Stephanie from That's What She Read have both told me I will love this book because it contains some fantastic elements of body horror. This book is all about a troop of Boy Scouts who are out in the wilderness when they come across this crazy man with a voracious appetite, and at first the scoutmaster is trying to help him out, but something is very wrong with this man, and things just go from bad to worse. And I hate to give away too much of the plot. I always lean towards saying less, but what I will tell you is that this book was very intense. It was very fast-paced. I really like Cutter's narrative style. While I wouldn't describe him as the strongest writer, I think he's very good at writing compelling narratives. And this book was so fast-paced, I just inhaled it and found that whenever I had a chance to sit down and read it, I just flew through the chapters. What I particularly loved was the perspective of the hungry man. I thought that Cutter did such a great job of describing that feeling of not being able to get full, of just being hungry and being unsatisfied. And I connected with it way more than I should have probably, but I love those aspects. That is one of my favorite aspects of survival horror, is that feeling of being hungry, because it just makes me very, very anxious as a person. So that was one of my favorite aspects. And of course, it's also a great example of gross out horror. This is easily one of the most visceral books I've read. There was a lot of stomach churning moments. You do not want to be reading and eating at the same time. But I love this one. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I can see why everyone gushes about this book so much. I thought it was phenomenal, and it was just right up my alley. If you enjoy very gross, gruesome stories, I would definitely recommend this one. It was a lot of fun. I should mention that I buddy read this with James Chatham, and that was also a great experience. He is a very analytical reader, so I felt like reading with him actually showed me a lot more about this book. He was able to talk about things about the character development that I would have never thought of. And if anything, I feel bad because while he was leaving me all these messages, really describing the plot and the characters, most of my comments back to him were like, oh my gosh, this book is so gross. I love it. Oh, it's so gross. And so I feel like I might have gotten more out of the buddy reading experience than he did, but regardless, I really enjoyed it. And he was a great buddy reader. He just went along with it and it was a lot of fun. So I definitely hope to buddy read with him again, and I do recommend checking out his channel if you're not yet subscribed. I also want to mention the short story anthology that I read this month, and that was Tales from a Talking Board, which is edited by Ross E. Lockhart. I did request this from Word Horde, so I did a separate review that I put out on the release stage. And if you haven't watched that video, I'll tell you a little bit more about the collection. As the title suggests, this entire collection is centered around the theme of Ouija boards, which I personally find super creepy. And I am just in love with short stories as a whole these days. I just cannot get enough of horror short stories. So within this collection is a wide range. Some of the stories are very dark and gruesome, and some of the stories are very light and could be consumed by someone who is a bit more of a scaredy cat. As with pretty much every anthology, there's going to be some stories that I liked more than others. I ended up giving it 4 stars just because there were some stories in the collection that I didn't particularly like that much, so it made it hard to give the story collection as a whole 5 stars. But within the collection, there were several stories that I would have given 5 stars to had I been rating them by themselves. So if you're interested to hear more about those particular stories, I'm going to have a link to the actual review video, which goes into more detail about some of my favorite stories in the collection, what they're all about. But if you're a fan of horror short stories or want to try out a great collection, I definitely recommend this one. I just loved a few of the short stories in this collection. I want to reread them and just could not recommend them enough. So that is definitely a recommendation there. Now, for something a little different than I normally read, I picked up a children's horror book, and that was The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Years ago, I read Coraline by him and really enjoyed that one. Even though it's meant for children, I actually consider that book to be fairly creepy. So I've had The Graveyard Book on my Goodreads TBR for years, and I finally picked it up this month as an audiobook, which is narrated by Neil Gaiman, which is one of my favorite aspects of it. I really like him as a narrator. I just think he has a great voice for narration, and he's just fantastic. The story itself is very cutesy. It's hard for me to rate it as an adult because I did find the story to be much more cute than creepy, but I realize that I'm not the intended audience. However, compared to Coraline, I would say that Coraline is much creepier. but I still like that Neil Gaiman does not talk down to his readers. He's actually addressing a lot of really dark subjects in this book. He mentions suicide and murder. Now, I suppose I should actually tell you the synopsis. This is about a young boy who is left in a graveyard and is raised by ghosts. His family was murdered, so in order to keep him safe, he is told to stay inside the graveyard. And he grows up, as I mentioned, being raised by the ghosts that live in this area. And despite the darker, creepier setting of this book, it's actually, like I said, much more cute. A lot of the themes are about friendship and finding yourself and more of those kind of cutesy, heartwarming themes, but the ending was actually pretty intense and thrilling for a kid's book, and I did find it a lot of fun. If you enjoy Neil Gaiman, I do recommend checking this one out. It's just overall a good story. I did still give it 4 stars. Finally, I want to talk graphic novels, and I read volumes 1 through 3 of Locke Key by Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez. I planned on reading the entire 6 volumes this month, but frankly, the 4th book did not come in from the library in time, so I'm going to finish up the series in November, so you can watch for that in the wrap-up video then. But this is a fantastic, gruesome story about a family whose father was brutally murdered, and the family moves back to their hometown where they proceed to live in this creepy old house that has these magical keys with some strange properties that can do different things. It's very dark and gruesome, but at the same time it deals with a lot of family themes. It's very emotional and is heartwarming at times. The youngest child, Bode, is so cute, and I really did enjoy this story. At times, I did find it a little confusing. There is a lot of characters going on, a lot of switching perspectives, switching scenes, but it was just a really enjoyable series. And the other graphic novel series I started this month was Wytches by Scott Snyder, which is about a family who moves to a smaller town. They are escaping a tragedy and moving away. It actually has a really similar synopsis to Locke Key, but it is quite a different story. And the book centers around the main character, this young girl who is trying to fit in her new school and move on with her life. And while the story does surround witches, they are not the classic witches you're thinking of with the pointy hats. Instead, while they're called witches, these are more of obscure monsters that live in this forest. And I really did like the gruesome aspects of this book. There were some very intense, dark scenes in it, but I did find the story to be very confusing at times. The switching perspectives was all over the place. There was a lot of flashbacks, and I found myself kind of having to reread panels and scenes to try to figure out how it all linked together. And while it does have these darker moments, again, I sound like I'm re-describing Locke Key, but I also would say that this other book, Wytches, dealt a lot with family and anxiety, and a lot of really emotional issues play into it. The theme of family is very core to the story, and I kind of have mixed feelings when it comes to those like emotional stories. I'm more of a fan of stories that kind of leave the emotions at the door and are just about being dark and creepy, but I do somewhat recommend this book. I gave it, I think, 3.5 stars. I liked aspects of it, but it wasn't perfect. So I might continue on with the series. I'd love to know if it's worth reading the rest of it. So that is it. Those are all the horror books I read in the month of October. Because it is the month of reading creepy books, I would love to hear about some of your favorites that you read this month. What were the creepiest books you read? Did anything actually scare you? As always, thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Thanks. Okay, bye.